Welcome. My name is Amy Elias, and I am the director of the UT Humanities Center on the campus of the University of Tennessee. And I welcome you to this meeting of our Distinguished Lecture Series with Allison Carruth. The Distinguished Lecture Series is public and free and presents some of the best and brightest minds of our time doing arts and humanities scholarship. So we're really glad you're here, and this is a really exciting lecture that I'm sure you're going to enjoy. Just as a public service announcement, I just let you know that on November 1st, virtually next week, we will also be featuring Robert Bullard, who is known as the father of environmental social justice. And so I hope you can make that lecture also, and all of that information is on our UTHC website. So it's my distinct pleasure today to welcome Allison Carruth. She's a friend of mine and an immensely respected scholar in environmental studies and narrative studies. She's on the faculty at Princeton University, where she's professor now of American Studies and the High Meadows Environmental Institute. She's held prior faculty appointments at UCLA and the University of Oregon. And her research includes environmental narrative, media in art, science communication, contemporary food movements, and evolving relationships between technology, ecology, and environmentalism. For over a decade, Allison Carruth's scholarship and creative practices have bridged ideas from and the boundaries between the arts and humanities and the sciences, which makes her research really exciting to us at UT. Collaborative projects have been central to this work. She's worked with the Food Justice Conference, and she did an amazing project called Play the River that we might hear about today. She was the founding director of UCLA's Laboratory for Environmental Narrative Strategies. The acronym is LENS. And while leading that, she was an executive producer of an environmental series featuring original essays and documentary films developed in partnership with the country's largest public media outlet. She's the author of a number of books: Global Appetites, American Power in the Literature of Food, and Literature and Food Studies. And she's currently completing a book titled Novel Ecologies that is under contract with the University of Chicago Press. Her publications have appeared in numerous journals internationally, and her work has been supported by the National Science Foundation, ArtPlace America, and other major funding sources. So it's really my pleasure today to introduce Allison Carruth, who will be talking to us about Nature Remade, the power of tech in contemporary environmentalism. Hi, Allison.
Hi, thank you so much, Amy, for inviting me to be here today virtually and to share some of my current work in progress. On that topic, I will share screen. And thank you all for joining here today. I am just really delighted to have received this invitation from Amy and the Humanities Center at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. This is actually the first time I've spoken in this way about my project Novel Ecologies since the pandemic began in March of 2020. So I've shifted the title slightly to reflect some emerging thinking about this project, and the title of my talk is Nature Rebooted. And with that, I will get underway. These two short missives, one from Stuart Brand in 1968 and the other from the editors of Wired in 2006, will frame my talk. First, we are as gods and might as well get good at it. The second, rebooting the ecosystem. Global warming is real. We did it. Now it's time to talk about repairs. In 1989, Bill McKibben published the first book about global warming for a broad audience, at least by his and others' accounts. The title was The End of Nature. McKibben was in his late 20s when he began writing his account of how human habitats, economies, and ways of life came to change the weather, as he put it. In the 4 decades since, he has made nature in the time of global warming the center of what Richard White calls a literary enterprise. And as a particularly influential literary voice on behalf of climate science and climate action, McKibben has told a story not just of ecological crisis, but of a crisis in meaning, the end of nature as an idea. This loss of the world outdoors as a separate and wild province, in his words, arguably has defined the values and fears of white environmentalists for decades. And although environmentalists like McKibben have joined collective struggles against extractive capitalism, their ecological grief belies an investment in liberal individualism that has informed alternately tragic and alarmist rhetoric, or what environmental humanities scholars refer to as environmental elegy and eco-apocalypse. About one thing, McKibben and a growing group of scientists, engineers, designers, and writers who embrace rather than lament the loss of the received idea of nature agree. Nature today is nowhere unaltered by people. This recognition leads to another. Our imagination of nature must change. The Holocene gives way to the Anthropocene, a geological zeitgeist in which human technologies touch, quote, every flux and cycle of the planet's ecology and geochemistry, to quote two of the most prominent of what I'm calling the Anthropocene optimists, Peter Kariva and Michel Marvier, both scientists. This point opens on to my current project, Novel Ecologies, which argues that a new environmental imagination is developing out of both confrontations and convergences among engineering, ecology, and environmentalism in contemporary American culture. I think about this imaginary in the language of art adaptation as nature remade, in the language of software as nature rebooted, a discourse centered on the West Coast. Its animating premise is that ecosystems must be technologically retrofitted to sustain privileged modes of human life rather than remediated and redressed through collective deliberation and structural change. For adherents, this belief takes engineering as an a priori good. My own focus in the project is on the period since the late 80s when climate science and network computing began to promote divergent views of an increasingly interconnected planet. Novel Ecologies attends to the ambivalent allure of nature rebooted by examining emerging technologies such as transgenic seeds, more commonly known as GMOs, synthetic wildlife, and terraformed planets. It puts these technologies into dialogue with the work of writers and artists who variously adapt, extrapolate into the future, and oppose outright what I call high-tech environmentalism. As for its substance, the book opens with GMO field trials in Hawaii and in the Midwest, and a set of artworks that satirize transgenic seed patenting. It closes with the space colony aspirations of tech billionaires juxtaposed to a body of fiction, poetry, and sound art that is enchanted by space exploration and yet deeply critical of world building. The part of this project that I'm going to speak about from here on out comes from the MIPIT, two chapters, interconnected chapters on rewilding, de-extinction, and synthetic biodiversity. In 1993, Wired magazine launched as the sometimes laudatory, sometimes critical voice of the industry we now call tech. The magazine's early years anticipate how that industry would come to define economic, political, and cultural life in and ultimately far beyond its California epicenter. Less obviously, but no less significantly, the magazine shows the power of tech in challenging the aim of protecting natural systems from industrial societies and advocating instead for remaking those systems by way of post-industrial technologies. Case in point, a 1997 essay titled The Long Boom, A History of the Future. Written near the midpoint of its 1980 to 2020 speculative timeline, The Long Boom sees the recent past and near future as linked by, quote, prosperity, freedom, and a better environment. Making the case for the plausibility of this view, the author begins with two countervailing accounts of where the century is heading. And I quote, a bad meme, a contagious idea began spreading through the United States in the 1980s. America is in decline. The world is going to hell and our children's lives will be worse than our own. By the late 90s, another meme began to gain ground. Born of the surging stock market and an economy that won't die down, this one is more positive. America is finally getting its economic act together. The world is not such a dangerous place, yet the good times will only come to a privileged few. Against the alarm of the first and the circumspection of the second, the essay promotes a radically optimistic view of what the next century holds, namely a global economic boom on a scale never experienced before, the author observes. Neoliberalism is central to this sunny future, which rests on, quote, an ascendant Asia, a revitalized America, and a reintegrated greater Europe, including a recovered Russia. I don't probably need to spend much time noting how spectacularly this vision of the time that we now live in has not come to pass. But above all, the long boom emanates from engineering unfettered by governance. Waves of technology identified in turn as deregulated telecom, network computing, applied biotech, and the rise of nanomaterials. The author admits that global warming and authoritarianism threaten to derail all this. His solution is yet more technology. Interactive media will facilitate an unprecedented democratization of politics in this speculative future, while renewable energy will arrive just in time to supplant the juggernaut of oil and gas and assure a kind of worldwide post-industrial capitalism. But the evident cosmopolitanism here belies an American exceptionalism, according to which the US is at once the great innovator nation and the closest thing to a workable multicultural society. Contra the ongoing violence generated by racism, xenophobia, and anti-science today, and profoundly out of step with social and climate justice movements, the long boom wraps US empire in technological utopia. Part 2, the whole earth to belong now. Decades before the tech industry captivated first Wired and then media culture at large, the seeds for Nature Rebooted took shape in Sausalito, California, through the pages of the Whole Earth catalog and the network built by its founding editor, Stuart Brand. We are as gods and might as well get good at it, famously read the catalog's inaugural editorial statement. The missive is oft quoted in accounts of how Brand, the catalog, and the spin-off online platform known as The Well connected mostly white back to the land environmentalists with programmers and investors who would make Silicon Valley the global tech center it is today. Dispensing with government, big business, formal education, and the church, Brand calls on his 1968 readers to conduct their own education, find their own inspiration, and shape their own environment. The imperative dismisses both institutions and movements. It does so by appealing to subsistence living on the one hand and inventive engineering on the other, as evident in the categories around which issues of the catalog were organized, such as shelter and land use, seed saving, industry and craft, cybernetics, computer hardware, local self-reliance, and sustainable technology. Most significantly, the future the catalog aspired to was one organized around individuals with the resources and cultural capital to live in what Brand called a realm of intimate personal power. Today, Brand has moved on from the whole earth to what he calls the long now. And the long now investment with the most traction follows through on Brand's 1968 call on the whole earth community to shape their own environment. Through a venture called Revive and Restore, Brand and his wife, the biotech investor Ryan Phelan, are supporting scientists in the fields of synthetic biology and ancient DNA studies, also known as paleogenetics. Their goal, bring back extinct animals. To date, this gambit of genetic rescue, also known as de-extinction, has focused on iconic species endemic to North America. The woolly mammoth, which went extinct some 11,000 years ago during the late Pleistocene period, and the passenger pigeon, whose enormous flocks collapsed rapidly a century ago due to hunting and habitat fragmentation. These are what biologists call charismatic megafauna. Mega in terms of either size, like the mammoth, or ecological scale, like the passenger pigeon population. Their genetic revival promises at once to atone for biodiversity loss and mitigate global warming. As an example, the still far-fetched plan of repopulating North America and Russia with the woolly mammoth is staked on the giant species' capacity, if brought back from the dead, to compact tundra soils and thus stem the potentially catastrophic release of carbon held in the permafrost. Over the past decade or so, de-extinction has not surprisingly inspired controversy, and with it numerous monikers, from resurrection biology and species revivalism to zombie zoology. The labels highlight a tension between state-of-the-art science, made newly plausible by CRISPR gene editing, a point I'm happy to discuss more in the Q&A, and Eurocentric histories of alchemy, vitalism, and the supernatural that make the mastery over nature a central feature of human dominion. So until recently, almost no one outside a small circle had ever heard the word de-extinction or known this research was happening in a small handful of labs in the US and Europe primarily. In 2010, a literature review of the topic yielded just a couple dozen citations. 10 years later, the same search netted a combined 2,000 peer-reviewed papers and news stories. Given that the basic science behind de-extinction began in the 80s, what explains this exponential growth in academic and popular interest? Answering that question demonstrates, I argue, the capacities of narrative not only to communicate, but to catalyze both scientific research and research funding. Although they do represent a small group centered around just a few labs, those behind de-extinction have been highly effective storytellers and captivating characters. Through stories they've produced and occasion, this group, in which brand has been especially visible, has blended ecological nostalgia with engineering ingenuity to make the case that biotech is a crucial tool in the 21st century for preserving wilderness and mitigating climate change, all while avoiding themselves sustained political or academic scrutiny. At first blush, de-extinction calls to mind not just the blockbuster fantasy of Jurassic Park, which I imagine may already be in the back of some of your minds, but also canonical literary tales of technological overreach, from Mary Shelley's 1818 novel Frankenstein to Aldous Huxley's 1932 dystopian work, Brave New World. Cognizant of these connections, boosters respond by distancing de-extinction from science fiction through appeals to awesome, exciting innovations that make new life forms from scratch. It's my argument that the organizing narrative of de-extinction thus transforms rewilding, which was first coined to mean simply the expansion of existing wildlife preserves beyond state and national borders, into a capacious vision of nature rebooted. So part 3, the ongoing troubles with American wilderness. Crucial to this narrative is a recent movement in environmental science termed New Conservation. According to the New Conservationists, the Anthropocene describes not just anthropogenic planetary crisis, but also a time in which people will increasingly and deliberately shape nature for the better. Seeing the Anthropocene in this light inspires a heretofore unthinkable, exciting, and energizing thought: we can make more nature, to quote science writer Emma Maris. Her book Rambunctious Garden glosses recent research on novel ecosystems, the key scientific term that informs my book's title, Novel Ecologies. The book discusses, for example, the case of Ascension Island in the South Atlantic as evidence that plants introduced by British colonial scientists and prospectors, quote, resulted not in ecological meltdown, but in the creation of a cloud forest composed of species from here and there, end quote. It also profiles self-described space ecologist Joe Masgrove's findings that an exotic dominated ecosystem in Hawaii is functioning better than nearby native forests, a story Maris relays with no mention of native Hawaiian conservation projects and their importance to indigenous sovereignty struggles. These case studies recuperate as an ecological boon the global flows of species initiated by colonialism and accelerated by capitalism. Thus, Maris ends the book by sketching a best case future in which wild places are engineered to be ecologically sound, aesthetically satisfying, economically rewarding, and favorable to the continued growth of civilization. Two of the most cited scientists in the literature of new conservation have sought to align it with environmental justice, an idea that Perez reinforces in her book. Those claims invoke both environmental justice politics on the ground and scholarly critiques of settler colonial wilderness mythology and the history that goes along with it. And yet new conservationists tend to move too easily between express support on the one hand for the integrity of indigenous lands and the inclusion of disenfranchised communities in environmental decision-making, and on the other, collaboration with corporations, including oil and gas companies. New conservationists seek to resolve this contradiction via the language of design. More pointedly, they promote the strength and resilience of nature as an ecological principle that should inform the right kind of development by design, done with the right kinds of technology. And in the same breath as they warn against scolding capitalism, they further contend that the intentional design of natural systems will, quote, benefit the widest number of people, especially the poor. There's a rhetorical sleight of hand here, I would argue, that misapprehends what sociologist Ramachandra Guha has identified as environmentalism of the poor. New conservation fashions itself as a bridge, or more aptly, a broker between capitalism, science, and justice. But its advocates water down critiques that scholars like Guha, Carolyn Finney, and William Cronin have developed in tracing historical relationships between colonialism, capitalism, and wilderness. Through those critical lenses, the trouble with wilderness, to cite Cronin's 1995 essay, is not that it stymies capitalism as new conservation frets, but that it co-evolves with it. The 1964 Wilderness Act illustrates this point. And the act begins by defining wilderness areas as primeval, places that most differ from, quote, the areas where man and his own works dominate the landscape. And yet, a few paragraphs later, wilderness is essentially redesignated to accommodate, quote, any activity, including prospecting, if carried on in a manner compatible with the preservation of the ecosystem, as determined, of course, by future legislation and regulation, or more often than not, deregulation. This map here, before I move on, is showing the drastic shrinking of the Bears Ears National Monument, which sits on the lands of 5 tribes during the Trump administration years. So this point returns us to de-extinction, which speaks to the ongoing troubles with the American wilderness in the context of Anthropocene optimism. Informed by new conservation, de-extinction emerges from a commitment to generate wilderness, and more pointedly, wildlife from scratch. At the same time, the leading narrators of de-extinction science downplay the ethical and political questions about making animals in labs for release into private preserves. And they do so by interlacing nostalgia for the pre-human past with hope for a technological future. There have really been just 4 people who have played the most prominent role in crafting and advancing this narrative. Scientists George Church and Beth Shapiro at Harvard and UC Santa Cruz, respectively, together with Ben Novak, a passenger pigeon enthusiast who has sort of ended up in Shapiro's lab thanks to funding by Brand, who has also supported Shapiro and Church's labs more broadly. For the rest of my remarks about de-extinction, I'll focus just on Shapiro and Brand. In How to Clone a Mammoth, Shapiro sets out to provide a layperson's guide to the ethical considerations and technical procedures that de-extinction involves. At first glance, the book is circumspect and pragmatic. Even under the best of conditions, Shapiro explains, DNA likely survives no longer than 100,000 years, give or take. And the older the DNA, the more fragmented it will be when researchers like herself and her team extract it from preserved biological tissue. Making things still trickier, such DNA is prone to contamination, including in the lab by the researchers themselves. As a result, the tool, the highly sensitive tool that identifies genetic fragments of interest, the same PCR method used in COVID-19 testing, will preferentially find and make copies of clean, undamaged, freely floating, unbroken, contaminating DNA, to quote Shapiro. The upshot, a future with dinosaurs, remains squarely in the domain of Hollywood, while the oldest candidates for de-extinction were likely those alive at the end of the Pleistocene when both mammoths and saber-toothed cats perished. Shapiro concludes extinct species are gone forever. We will never bring back something that is 100% identical physiologically, genetically, and behaviorally to a species that is no longer alive. What is achievable, she argues, is the revival of extinct traits introduced into related living species, creating hybrid proxies in order to meet contemporary challenges and desires. Not everyone is as circumspect as Shapiro about de-extinction's prospects. In Rise of the Necrophant, Ray holds that de-extinction is advancing environmental science not by making strides through painstaking lab research and basic science, but by spurring, quote, others to imagine how they might use similar methods for their own interests. She further observes that it's not the abundance of research in this area that's so striking, it's how well above its weight it punches. The point is well taken. While still on the fringes of the life sciences, de-extinction has produced a charismatic mega narrative with its story of a bright ecological future teeming with wildlife of human design. That narrative has gained steam in no small measure due to Brand, who aims to advance the story of environmentalism through such wild schemes, ranging from climate engineering to de-extinction itself. In 2013, shortly before the centenary of the last known passenger pigeon, Martha's, death at the Cincinnati Zoo in 1913, Brand delivered a TED Talk titled The Dawn of De-Extinction. Are you ready? The hook was a National Geographic claim that innovation in the current century will happen via making rather than finding things. The talk opens with individual examples of modern extinctions, a catalog that centers on the rapid decline and total collapse, ultimately, of passenger pigeons. Brand then glosses the basic science in a step-by-step format kindred to that of Shapiro's book, while depicting the researchers in heroic terms. He concludes with a call to join these biotech trailblazers in building an evolution machine. Brand's emphasis on heroic feats of biotech-driven rewilding has proven to be an effective narrative strategy, as evident in the earned media that the TED Talk and subsequent symposia have enjoyed. That coverage included novelist Nathaniel Rich's New York Times Magazine essay, along with a National Geographic cover story by the science writer Carl Zimmer. And it helps to explain why both the popular and the peer-reviewed literature on de-extinction exploded after 2013. So I'm going to play just two very short excerpts from the talk before continuing.
Now, extinction is a different kind of death. It's bigger. We didn't really realize that until 1914, when the last passenger pigeon, a female named Martha, died at the Cincinnati Zoo. This had been the most abundant bird in the world. It had been in North America for 6 million years. So they wasn't here at all. Flocks that were a mile wide and 400 miles long used to darken the sun. Aldo Leopold said this was a biological storm, a feathered tempest. And indeed, it was a keystone species that enriched the entire eastern deciduous forest, from the Mississippi to the Atlantic, from Canada down to the Gulf. But it went from 5 billion birds to 0 in just a couple decades. What happened? Well, commercial hunting happened. These birds were hunted for meat that was sold by the ton. And it was easy to do because when those big flocks came down to the ground, they were so dense that hundreds of hunters and netters could show up and slaughter them by the tens of thousands. It was the cheapest source of protein in America. By the end of the century, there was nothing left but these beautiful skins in museum specimen drawers. There's an upside to the story. Because the fact is, humans have made a huge hole in nature in the last 10,000 years. We have the ability now, and maybe the moral obligation, to repair some of the damage. Most of that we'll do by expanding and protecting wildlands, by expanding and protecting the populations of endangered species. But some species that we killed off totally, we could consider bringing back to a world that misses them. Thank you.
So in one sense, Brand's story here builds on concerns in conservation, traditional conservation, not just with charismatic megafauna, but with individual members of such species, from Martha, the last passenger pigeon, to Lonesome George, the Galapagos Islands' last Pinta Island tortoise. But his story turns away from what Ursula Heise has called extinction elegy to advance the idea that death can be undone and human history reversed by rejiggering the genes of an extinct creature's nearest living relative, as Elizabeth Colbert has written about Brand in an essay titled CRISPR and the Splice to Survive. What's more, Brand's techno-optimism papers over the mechanistic view of life behind the Revive and Restore project, which turns biodiversity stewardship into a technology of making things. We see this at work in the ways that de-extinction enthusiasts like Brand reduce what is a technically complex and socially vexed set of methodologies into a replicable recipe. At one point in the talk, Brand pivots from extolling de-extinction as next-gen technology to representing it as a kind of movement via a new conservationist appeal to Anthropocene hope. This move embeds a kind of scientific wonkiness and a beguiling tale of genetic rescue that is ostentatious and upbeat, as Brand's closing words drive home. In contrast to his opening catalog of recent extinctions that are human-caused, the conclusion pans out to the span of the Holocene. Humans have made a huge hole in nature in the last 10,000 years, a global footprint that in Brand's mind makes not just environmental protection and remediation, but also re-engineering of nature essential. The premise guides Brand's ending command to dispense with environmentalist sorrow, anger, and mourning. As he says, don't mourn, organize. But in his narrative, to organize means not political activism or structural change, not the collective work of building movements, but technological investment and entrepreneurial networking. Consider Brand's example of American bison as the upside of the public grief produced by the passenger pigeon's collapse. Prior to European colonialism and white settlement, the North American plains were famously the habitat for upwards of 30 million buffalo. By the end of the 19th century, there were less than 1,000 individuals on the continent. Moreover, a central driver of this population collapse was state-sponsored mass slaughter designed to starve Native American tribes. While conservation actions over the 20th century prevented the full extinction of American bison, there are today just 31,000 individuals who live in, quote, conservation herds managed in the public interest by governments and environmental organizations, while the species continues to be listed as near threatened by the IUCN Red List. Far from the upside of the passenger pigeon extinction, the history of the American bison is inextricable from colonialism. It is a history that Sioux, Anishinaabe, and other Native tribes are currently tackling in spearheading new bison conservation and restoration efforts. Interestingly, How to Clone a Mammoth shares with Brand's narrative the misrepresentation of anthropogenic extinctions that derive from colonialism and US expansionism. Misrepresents them as of a piece with Ice Age biodiversity loss. To this point, Shapiro refers to Indigenous Americans primarily to draw false equivalency between the environmental impacts of the first peoples, the Clovis, in the Americas, and white settlers. Although Shapiro's criteria for de-extinction are more persuasive than the variously symbolic, emotional, and economic reasons that Brand stresses, How to Clone a Mammoth thus reinforces a pattern in new conservation that puts settler communities at the helm of present and future nature rebooting. Thus does Shapiro recount her and fellow researchers' summer fieldwork in Siberia searching for mammoth remains without addressing Yupik or Inuit sovereignty, despite a brief note that mammoth digs are deeply personal to the region's indigenous people and are actually in conflict with the Yupik belief that touching woolly mammoths will bring bad luck. This comparison of Brand and Shapiro leads to a critical conclusion. As with new conservation broadly, the narrative of de-extinction that its supporters have crafted fails to grapple with the violent environmental histories and current justice struggles that bear directly upon its aspirations of bringing species back to life. So where do we go from here, to put a question Brand raises in the TED Talk to different ends? One strategy for countering the story of de-extinction that Brand and others offer is to address the siloing of scientific research, as well as the amplifying capacities of science journalism. It is these twin dynamics that have been determining how de-extinction is taking shape in the real world and who is at the table of deciding its future. My intervention is to turn attention to artists and writers who work on behalf of lost species and endangered ecosystems, and for whom that work is historical and political. These are artists and writers who envision futures of biodiversity conservation in conjunction with collective organizing and community science. So in this final part of my talk, I want to just first pause to say that it has been in researching and working with these kinds of artists, writers, who I also think about as environmental knowledge creators, that my initial ideas about de-extinction were challenged. When I began thinking about de-extinction, I was actually quite drawn to the question of how narratives like Brand's compared to other strategies of environmental hope, play, and comedy I've been exploring at the time. But the more time I have spent with artistic and literary responses to extinction and to rewilding, I've been pushed to grapple with the very structures of feeling that Brand hopes to excise from the American environmental imagination: feelings of outrage, despair, and above all, mourning. So just two examples by way of conclusion. Encountering Maya Lin's ongoing project, What is Missing, was how this concern with mourning became a focal point for me in my work on de-extinction. Lin has identified What is Missing as the fifth and final work in her memorial series, which began with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in DC, which opened in 1982, and includes the Civil Rights Memorial in Montgomery, 1989, the Women's Table at Yale, 1993, and the multi-site confluence project that follows sections of the Columbia River and the Lewis and Clark Trail. As compared to these four prior memorials, which are all site-specific installations, What is Missing is a participatory online archive of plant, animal, fungal, and biotic extinctions or endangerments. Its interactive map and multimedia atmosphere tie localized instances of biodiversity loss to different bodies of ecological knowledge and forms of conservation action. It is accordingly an open-ended environmental artwork, one that retrains the attention of participants on, in Lin's words, natural phenomena that people may not even be aware are disappearing. From the collective species memorial that is What is Missing, I'll turn as a second and final example to a Pacific Island bird that has been important to both old and new conservation, but also to the poetry of Chamorro poet Craig Santos Perez. Poetry that reckons with why it is and what it means that so many indigenous birds have gone extinct in the Chamorro homelands of Guam and the Mariana Islands. A poet, scholar, and activist, Perez currently teaches at the University of Hawaii. In American Quarterly and other venues, he has been a major voice for considering the Pacific Islands and their indigenous diasporas as part of American studies as a field. He is also a member of the Chamorro Indigenous Collective, and in this capacity, he's given testimony before the United Nations Special Political and Decolonization Committee on Self-Determination for Guam and the Mariana Islands, which are respectively an unincorporated territory and a Commonwealth of the United States. In 2016 testimony before the UN Committee, for instance, Perez addressed the relationships between the US occupation of Guam, the introduction of the invasive brown tree snake, and the island's knowledge that, quote, its Chamorro birds are disappearing. These commitments coalesce in an ongoing series of poems that Perez has written about one species native to Guam, the Micronesian kingfisher, or Isihek, part of a larger corpus titled From Unincorporated Territory. The poems gather a broad body of knowledge about biodiversity loss in Guam. They also challenge conservation approaches that prioritize captive breeding of endangered animals and what are known as ex situ restoration projects, primarily in zoos, over and against indigenous sovereignty and environmental expertise. Like the Guam rail, the Micronesian kingfisher is now classified as extinct in the wild. The multiple versions of Perez's poems about and for the bird can be understood as lyrical scholarship, I argue, occasioned by a captive breeding program that has been overseen by the Philadelphia Zoo since the late 1990s. Perez incorporates as source material for the poems protocols from a now out of print text called the Micronesian Kingfisher Survival Plan Husbandry Manual, 1998. Here are the opening lines from a 2017 reading Perez gave of one version of his Isihek poems. The full title is From Micronesian Kingfisher Isihek.
From the Micronesian Kingfisher, Isihek. 1. Our nightmare, no birdsong. The jungle was riven, emptied of Isihek. Bright blue, green, turquoise, red, gold feathers everywhere. Brown tree snakes, avian silence. The snakes entered without words. When we saw them, it was too late. They were at our doors, sliding along the passages of empire. Then the zookeepers came, called it Species Survival Plan, captured Isihek, and transferred the last 29 Micronesian kingfishers to American zoos for captive breeding, 1988. They repeated and repeated, if it weren't for us, your birds, Isihek, would be gone forever. What does not change? Last wild scene. 2. Exterior features, 1/4-inch plywood screen mesh cage front, Isihek, with bumpers and burlap shield. Quote, a rare Micronesian kingfisher chick weighing 5 grams, hatched at the National Zoo's Conservation and Research Center, 2004, Isihek. Interior ceiling, foam rubber or burlap stuffed with straw. External minimum size 9-inch by 9-inch. Internal height, minimum 10-inch clearance between floor and ceiling padding. Perching, Isihek, 1/2-inch diameter.
So rather than an extended analysis of this really magnificent and intricate poem, for today's occasion, I want to highlight its import vis-a-vis the narratives of de-extinction I've been tracing. Perez's memorial for the last wild Guam birds employs archival research to bring to life the birds' experience of captive breeding environments at zoos. This intimacy cuts through the bureaucratic specs for housing, feeding, handling, and breeding Micronesian kingfisher birds in zoos. The poem connects this avian perspective to its documentation of the US military occupation of Chamorro land. Through these and other strategies, Perez makes unimaginable a separation of biodiversity conservation from decolonization. The elegies for Isihek thus advance the moral, political, and scientific basis for in situ biodiversity conservation, guided by indigenous environmental justice. Here in other writings, though, Perez also shows that mourning in historically and culturally concrete contexts and forms is vital to knowing what causes biodiversity loss and what might actually be strategies of repair in the future. The relationship between rewilding and de-extinction that I have addressed at the beginning or earlier in my talk enacts a kind of feedback loop between eco-dystopian dread and techno-utopian optimism that reflects long-standing interdependencies between mythologies of pristine wilderness and engineered nature. The projects I'm connecting today and in this part of Novel Ecologies provide not just new narratives of biodiversity loss and its solutions, but in the case of the artists that I've ended with, I think more capacious and collective ones than those provided by new conservation and de-extinction boosters. At the same time, these expressive works of ecological mourning are works of research that challenge the premise that conservation in the Anthropocene must choose between restoring and rebooting nature. They insist on social transformation, especially with Perez's elegies, whose island birds are not meant for captivity nor for engineering. We encounter rich articulations of what the anthropologist Tom Van Doren calls living and dying in shared worlds. Such contemporary environmental arts offer a further caution about the long now thinking of new conservation, as has been routed through a kind of deep time nostalgia. In tying a Pleistocene American wilderness to what I've elsewhere termed green venture capital, the story of de-extinction scuttles environmental justice. And it is that problem that most can be confronted, I think, by the work of an artist like Perez. So I will close there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Allison. I'll let you get out of your screen share there. And there we go. And we have a number of questions in the Q&A. I'd remind everybody attending that you're welcome to put your questions in the Q&A, and I'll moderate them for Dr. Carruth, and she can answer them as they come in. We have one question immediately, and I'll throw it in the chat so everybody can see it. That is, what does narrative mean in the context of the Anthropocene or Capitalocene? Who is the narrator? What is the narrative about? And what is the imprimatur that sustains the narrative? I have in mind here, among others, Richard Powers and Amitav Ghosh. And I think I'll stay there because there's a second question.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. So I'm also just reading it. This is actually a benefit of this format, so I can really, really take in the multiple parts of the question. What does narrative mean in the context of the Anthropocene? Right, another term that has been put forward, a critical term in response to what I call Anthropocene optimism is Capitalocene. So, you know, first of all, what I would say is I think the Anthropocene has been primarily a narrative, right? The International Union of Geological Sciences has yet to make it an official new epic. We remain officially in the Holocene. Meanwhile, for the 21 years now since the term was first advanced or suggested by Paul Crutzen and Eugene Stormer in a one-page brief, the number of narratives that the Anthropocene has generated and the way in which the Anthropocene is indeed what I call a charismatic mega narrative, I think is really striking. Narratives that are, of course, not all arcing in the same direction or have the same sense of how anthropogenic climate change, how it matters, to whom it matters, who the actors are in terms of the causes and consequences and remediation. So I think that's the first thing to note, that the Anthropocene is a narrative, or rather a constellation of narratives, I think, first and foremost. Who is the narrator? I mean, that's a really interesting question, right? Because I think those who are kind of boosters for, like, let's, you know, David Biello, one of the popular writers whose cover I put up, says, you know, once you're in the Anthropocene, you cannot leave. It's like the Hotel California in that sense, he suggests. You know, so I think for Anthropocene embracers, the narrator is this kind of this human with a capital H, right? That is actually, you know, an extension of that liberal subject in the Enlightenment, in both colonial and capitalist kind of ideologies of the individual, right? So I think the racial dimensions of who narrates the Anthropocene as something that is to be embraced is really important here. And then I see that you also have in mind novelists and writers more broadly who have really generated this kind of cottage industry that is no longer a cottage industry, this huge kind of growing body of nonfiction and fiction around the Anthropocene and how we imagine it, how we tell its story, can we tell its story? So I appreciate that comment too.
Could you answer the second question here as well?
Right. Do you see a radical disconnect in our contemporary literature between the philosophically oriented discourses of posthumanism and critiques of anthropocentrism anchored in instrumentality and policymaking? So I'd be curious if this person wanted to if they're able to just add a little bit more of what they're thinking about here. What for them is the disconnect or the conflict that they have in mind. what I will say is I think posthumanism remains, although I think we see examples of the posthuman that predate the academic and theoretical discourse in science fiction, and both on the page and on the screen, and in a sense in the kind of technology worlds of artificial intelligence, robotics, and we could go on. But if we're thinking about posthumanism as an academic discourse and a theoretical discourse, it's highly specialized, and there are different schools within it and conflicts sort of within it that are, in my mind, kind of not reaching out into these broader social fields of popular science, of environmental politics on the ground, and in terms of governance. And so I think maybe there I see posthumanism as not really operating at the same social scale as Anthropocene discourses.
Terrific, thanks. We have another question in the Q&A. I didn't catch the name of the thinker you quoted a moment ago, vis-a-vis living and dying in shared worlds. Could you give that name?
I didn't catch that you quoted. Oh, that is Tom Van Doren. Let me also type the name. The Wake of Crows in particular was the book that I was quoting from. So Van Doren is an anthropologist, one of the people sort of associated with what's been called multi-species ethnography and multi-species justice. I also noticed that someone else, Carrie Stables, asked the question of who was performing that reading of the poem. That was Santos Perez himself. And it is available online. I would have to do some digging to find that particular recording, but that was him reading his work.
Very good. I had a question about the focus on individuals in your talk. I was interested in the kind of individual focus and the individual theory that you were talking about. I was wondering, we just did in our public books talk a novel by Matt Bell called Appleseed. And yeah, do you know it? It's a really,
I don't know, but I was like, that was on my radar that you were doing that talk. Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting in that the government itself sort of sells the United States to a major corporation who then engages in the kind of de-extinction that you're talking about, but for its own profit, and for essentially the enslavement of the entire world to remake the world in its own image. So it's very much a kind of dystopian vision, but it's a corporate vision. And I was wondering if you'd like to just muse about the difference between sort of individual theories like brands versus a kind of corporate vision of the kind that you're kind of pointing to in the Silicon Valley example.
Yeah, so go ahead. So what's your question, Amy, for me then, about sort of the relation between that fictional narrative and what's actually happening in?
No, the relationship between the individual narratives that people are spinning versus the corporate narrative.
Yes, right. Yeah, no, so one of the part of this research that I did not discuss today actually speaks to this question directly. So one of the people who was really pivotal in this, what was kind of a slow shift of what rewilding meant, away from a more kind of old conservation model of simply expanding wildlife corridors, wildlife parks, cross in particular the US-Mexico border, to be a concept that would accommodate the extinction and other emerging bio and environmental technologies. And that person was Ted Turner. And so the media billionaire actually is also, as some of you may know, a funder of various conservation projects, including on his own extensive private ranches and lands. And so he gathered a group of both kind of old conservationists and new conservationist scientists, an exclusively white male group, from what I've been able to determine, at his ranch about 15 years ago, in the early days of kind of just what was at the time kind of theoretical proposals towards Pleistocene rewilding, which is the kind of basis for de-extinction as I discussed it today. And he has become another kind of backer of this. I bring this up because when you start to follow that thread, what you see is that this represents potentially enormous profit, right? This is what I mentioned, I call green venture capital, right? The possibility of kind of privately held wildlife parks for these, and this is where Jurassic Park is in fact an appropriate, right, popular narrative to have in mind. So I think the potential for this to be another arena, right, for venture capital logics, right, is pretty significant.
Great. We have a question in the chat as well. I wonder if you could return to the function of elegy, which is memorial, but also an act of absolution that covers over the need for present action. How does narrative ask more of us? Must it make an instrumental policy turn to do so? What are the ways to prevent narrative from becoming elegy?
Yeah, thank you. These are marvelous questions. I'm reading it again. I just really want to take it in. Well, first of all, your question really, I think, asks me to think about the distinction between elegy and physical memorial, or in the case of what is missing, a digital memorial, as forms, as cultural practices that may be sort of four different political possibilities. So I mean, I think, first of all, it bears noting that elegy's kind of roots are in poetry rather than narrative. And what I think is really interesting about these elegies for the last of a species is their kind of deeply lyrical quality, right? That they are in that tradition of memorial, which is quite different from, right, some kind of physical memorial like the Vietnam Veterans Wall, to speak to Maya Lin's brilliant memorial in DC, I think. So I think there's that elegy, I think, does have this connection to, the individual, the particularity of the individual life. Whereas memorial, I think, has had this capacity for abstraction, for the symbolic, and for kind of trying to kind of preserve a collective loss, right? Or in the case of certain memorial, to, kind of to instigate a kind of national or otherwise, right, ideological sense of who belongs in that collective. So I don't know, I think these are some of the things you're making me think about what are the differences between the work elegy memorial can do and how those do or don't get put to an environmental justice project like Perez's.
That's really interesting. There's a question about the loss of biodiversity in our Q&A. The idea of a loss of biodiversity was brought up a few times. Would de-extinction be able to help fix this? Like in the case of the birds native to Guam, would it only bring back species in a zoo-like setting, or would they be easily reintroduced without new situations similar to invasive species? Or can we even know this without actually bringing back a species?
Yeah, these are really good questions. And actually, one of the things that I first will say is that across this project, Novel Ecologies, the grandiosity and the giganticism of the narratives, of the rhetoric that is sort of crafted by these Anthropocene optimists, these techno-utopian figures ranging from Brand to Elon Musk in the space colony chapter I end with, the scale of the narrative and its promise is enormous. The actual, and I think in some ways what that does, and it generates an incredible amount of public attention, of real dollars of investment, and of profit or potential profit. It papers over what are actually kind of likely to be very small scale impacts on the problem they purport to solve. So almost no serious scientist, whether in support of or skeptical of de-extinction, thinks that this is going to bring back the hundreds of thousands of species that constitute what's called the sixth mass extinction. And if we were to, the cascading unintended consequences would be, mind-boggling, any more than that private trips to the space station or eventually to Mars, for an extremely elite echelon of those who can pay, SpaceX or Blue Origin, et cetera, Bezos' space company, is likely to in fact lead to us all living in space. Now, in some cases, I think this high-tech environmentalism, as I call it, is in a way a sort of shell game that's kind of preventing or attempting to distract us from what is the real play, right? In the case of space colony discourse, I think space colonizers, the private space colonizers, I think it's actually mining in the asteroid belt, as others have discussed. In the case of de-extinction, I think this becomes a kind of incubator for seeing how far something like CRISPR can be taken without the public scrutiny that the actual founding scientists of CRISPR have called for, right? They've called for certain moratorium until the ethical and policy frameworks are worked out. So that's one thing I would offer in response to this really interesting question.
What do you do with someone like Kim Stanley Robinson? I'm thinking his 2312 is the book where he has everybody living on all the other planets, and they come back to Earth, and there's a rain. They bring all these de-extincted animals with them, and there's a rain of animals
Yes.
down onto the Earth. And he's done this in a number of novels. He's claimed that this revolt against what you're calling de-extinction is actually a call for a purity that never existed.
Right.
And in fact, creating animals and repopulating the world with them is something we can do. And it's only that narrative of you have to only have the pure wilderness or you can't have anything that will cause us not to do that, right? So how would you react to that?
Yeah, and I should say that Robinson is not a writer I am focused on this project, and I haven't spent time with this enormous body of work, but 2312 is the novel I know best. And I think on the one hand, I'm persuaded by that critique of the right of old conservation and of a certain kind of wilderness mythology or idea of the wild that Bill McKibben, especially in the nature, is articulating. But I actually think Robinson, as a novelist, in fact, participates in what I suggested was this kind of bad faith invocation of the scholarly and activist critiques of wilderness, mythology, or sort of pure nature fantasies. That actually is being deployed in order to, kind of, again, divert attention from what are some really problematic narratives that he puts in 2312 around race, around power, around geopolitics and governance. It's a deeply cynical book about the possibilities of collective structural change or collective governance. And so that's something I think that has become a sort of shorthand for saying, hey, we're hip to, that critique of wilderness, but it doesn't necessarily, to me, in that novel, read as authentic, I have to admit.
That's very interesting. So I think we're at the end of our hour. We've kept you for a while. If there are any last questions, I'd be happy to entertain them. But in the meantime, I thank you so much for that provocative talk and this really large subject that is so interesting. Love to have you back sometime. I'm sure everyone would love to talk with you. I want to make sure that I get all of the last questions. I think we have one last question here. Do you see it also in the chat? I read an interesting book by Karen Nicholson, who is a professor of the history of science at LMU in Munich, called Far Beyond the Moon, A History of Life Support Systems in the Space Age. While this work might not be directly connected to your work, it did resonate with me towards the end of your talk. Just thought you might like to take a look.
Oh, I'm grateful for the reference. I don't know it, but this sounds like a book I will love to read. So thank you for that. Yeah. And thank you, Amy, for having me. This was really a delight. I so appreciate it.
So glad you're here. And everyone, I hope you join us for other public discussions, particularly our upcoming Distinguished Visiting Speaker Series lecture by Robert Bullard coming up on November 1st. And I hope you join me in thanking Allison Carruth for her wonderful work and for joining us today. Thank you, Allison.
Thank you.